My name is Ethan. I'm 61 years old and I never believed in monsters. Spent 3 decades as a real estate appraiser, walking through abandoned farmhouses, surveying remote woodlands, evaluating properties in the deepest corners of Michigan's backcountry. You hear stories out there, locals spinning tales about things that shouldn't exist, trying to explain away sounds in the night or tracks they can't identify. I always figured people see what they want to see, especially when fear gets involved. I'm a man who deals in facts, square footage, property lines, market comparables. If I can't measure it, photograph it, and put it in a report, it doesn't exist. That's how I've lived my life, and it served me well. Until 3 years ago on Higgins Lake, when everything I thought I knew about the world got turned inside out. The wind's picking up outside my Traverse City home tonight, rattling the windows and piling fresh snow against the glass. I'm sitting in my living room, nursing a cup of coffee that's gone cold while I stare at the storm. It's the kind of winter evening that makes you grateful for warm walls and electric lights. The kind that used to make me eager to plan my next ice fishing trip. Used to. I've been carrying this story for 36 months now, and the weight of it has changed me. My wife asks why I don't go out on the ice anymore, why I sold all my fishing gear last spring. My buddies from the office wonder what happened to old Ethan, the guy who used to disappear every weekend from December through March, chasing pike and walleye through holes in the ice. They think I'm getting soft in my old age, maybe losing my nerve. If only it were that simple. See, there's something out there on Michigan's frozen lakes. Something that doesn't belong in any field guide or wildlife manual. Something that looks at you with intelligence that's both ancient and terrible. Something that makes every rational thought in your head scatter like minnows when a predator enters the water. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I've wrestled with whether to tell this story for 3 years now. But sitting here, watching the snow fall and remembering what I saw that February night, I can't keep it locked away anymore. Maybe it's because I'm getting older. Maybe it's because the nightmares haven't stopped. Or maybe it's because I think people deserve to know what's really out there in the dark spaces between our safe, well-lit towns. What I'm about to tell you happened on Higgins Lake, about 60 miles southeast of here. I know that lake like the back of my hand, every inlet, every drop-off, every spot where the fish like to winter. I'd been fishing those waters for over 30 years. Thought I knew everything there was to know about what lived beneath that ice. I was wrong about a lot of things. I've been ice fishing for over 4 decades now, ever since my old man first dragged me out to Houghton Lake when I was a teenager. Started as a real estate appraiser right out of college, and that work took me all over Michigan, from the Upper Peninsula down to the Indiana border. Every lake, every backcountry pond, every piece of water you can imagine. I've appraised hunting lodges on remote lakes where the only way in is by snowmobile, and I've evaluated waterfront properties on every major fishing destination in the state. People around Traverse City know me as the guy who can tell you about ice conditions on any lake within 100 miles. Hell, I've guided weekend warriors from Detroit and Chicago for the better part of 2 decades. They'd pay good money for someone who knew where the walleye were biting, how thick the ice ran, and which spots were safe to set up camp. I built a reputation on being prepared, being practical, and knowing the difference between a good fishing story and the truth. I know exactly how much propane my heater burns through in a 6-hour session, and I can read ice thickness by the sound my auger makes cutting through. When you spend 4 decades drilling holes through frozen lakes, You develop an ear for these things. The routine became something I could count on. November through March, every weekend that weather permitted, I'd be out on the ice somewhere. Houghton Lake for early season perch, Higgins Lake when the walleye were moving, sometimes up to Mullet Lake if I wanted to chase northern pike. During the week, I'd be tramping through some landowner's back 40 or measuring square footage in a hunting cabin, but weekends belong to the ice. I know Michigan wildlife the way most people know their neighborhood dogs. Bears denning up for winter, coyotes ranging in loose packs, the occasional wolf track if you got far enough north, white-tailed deer moving through heavy trails, cutting across frozen swamps. I'd seen lynx prints twice in 30 years, both times up near Grayling. Mountain lions were supposed to be extinct in Michigan, but I'd found tracks that made me wonder, though I kept those observations to myself. The thing about spending that much time in the wilderness is you develop a feel for what belongs and what doesn't. Every sound has its place. Every track tells a story. And every movement in your peripheral vision fits into a pattern you understand. I'd heard every kind of wolf howl, every coyote yip, every owl call that echoes across a frozen lake at night. That's why I need you to understand. When I tell you what I saw on Higgins Lake that February night, I'm not some city guy who gets spooked at the sight of a large dog. I'm not someone who sees shadows as monsters or turns a black bear sighting or into something supernatural. I know what should be out there and what shouldn't, and what I encountered that night shouldn't exist anywhere. Every February for the past 15 years, I'd made the same pilgrimage to Higgins Lake. It wasn't just about the fishing, though the lake trout and perch there were worth the 90-minute drive from Traverse City. It was about the ritual, the methodical preparation that reminded me why I loved this work, this life I'd built, evaluating properties across Michigan's wilderness. That particular weekend in February looked perfect on paper. The Weather Service called for clear skies, temperatures holding steady in the low 20s, cold enough to keep the ice thick and safe, but not so brutal that my hands would go numb handling equipment. I'd been watching the forecast for 3 days, cross-referencing it with ice reports from the local bait shops. 16 inches of solid ice across the main fishing areas. Perfect conditions. I spent Thursday evening in my garage, going through the familiar routine that had become as comforting as a prayer. I checked each pocket of my vest, already loaded with the essentials, spare leaders, sinkers, a backup reel. I'd inherited that vest from my father along with his old double-barrel shotgun, and both had served me well through decades of Michigan winters. The Duluth trading pants came next, heavy canvas reinforced at the knees, where I'd kneel on the ice. I'd learned long ago that cheap gear would fail you when you needed it most, and my work appraising remote properties had taught me to respect the wilderness. My Danner boots sat by the door, freshly waterproofed, their aggressive tread ready for whatever conditions the lake might offer. I loaded my gear with the same methodical precision I used when surveying a difficult property. Ice auger, shelter, portable heater, tackle box, organized with military efficiency. The fish finder went into its padded case, technology that would have amazed my father, but which I'd come to rely on for reading the lake's moods and finding where the fish were holding. The weather radio crackled softly in the background as I worked, confirming what I already knew. Saturday would dawn clear and cold, with light winds from the northwest. I'd have the lake mostly to myself. Most weekend warriors preferred the more accessible spots closer to town. Leaving Higgins Lake's northern reaches to those of us willing to make the extra effort. I remember feeling that familiar surge of anticipation as I secured everything in the truck bed. This was my element, my escape from the endless paperwork and phone calls that filled my weeks. Out on the ice, the only things that mattered were reading the water, understanding the fish, and respecting the environment that had shaped me since childhood. Saturday morning, I'd be on the road before dawn, reaching the lake as the first pale light touched the frozen surface. I'd have my shelter up and my first lines in the water before most people had finished their morning coffee. It was a routine I'd followed dozens of times in conditions far worse than what Saturday promised. I had no reason to expect that this trip would be any different from all the others. No reason to think that by Sunday evening everything I thought I knew about Michigan's wilderness would be turned upside down. I arrived at Higgins Lake at 4:30 in the morning, my truck's headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as I pulled into the familiar access point. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read -8 degrees. Perfect ice fishing weather. After 3 decades of working Michigan's backcountry properties, I developed an appreciation for the kind of bitter cold that keeps the casual outdoorsman at home. The silence hit me first as I stepped out of the cab. That complete, crystalline quiet you only get on a frozen lake before sunrise, when the world feels suspended in time. My breath formed thick clouds in the frigid air as I unloaded my gear from the truck bed. The portable shelter, my tackle box, the Strike Master auger that had served me faithfully for 15 seasons. Everything felt reassuringly familiar as I shouldered my equipment and trudged toward my preferred spot about 200 yards from shore. The ice beneath my Danner boots was solid, at least 16 inches, I estimated, listening to the way my footsteps echoed across the frozen surface. Perfect conditions. The kind of morning that reminded me why I'd been coming to this lake every February for the past decade. I fired up the auger, its 2-stroke engine shattering the morning stillness as the 8-inch blade bit through the ice. The sound always gave me satisfaction, that mechanical certainty cutting through nature's frozen barrier. 3 holes, spaced 10 feet apart in a triangle pattern. Methodical, efficient. The way I'd approached every aspect of my life, from property assessments to weekend fishing trips. By the time I had my portable shelter erected and my lines in the water, the eastern horizon was showing the first pale hints of dawn. I settled into my canvas camp chair inside the shelter, adjusted the propane heater, and checked my depth finder. 32 feet of water beneath me with good structure on the bottom. Fallen trees and rock piles where the perch and walleye liked to congregate. The familiar ritual calmed me. Baiting hooks with minnows from the bucket I'd picked up at Mel's bait shop in Roscommon. Adjusting the tension on my tip-ups. Setting my coffee thermos within easy reach. This was my element. The intersection of preparation, patience, and knowledge accumulated over decades of Michigan winters. I pulled my first fish 20 minutes after sunrise, a nice walleye, maybe 16 inches, then another. The bite was steady, consistent, exactly what I had expected from this spot during the peak of the winter season. I worked efficiently, my hands moving with practiced precision despite the cold. Everything was going according to plan. The ice was solid, the fish were biting, and I had the entire lake to myself, a rare treat even for someone who preferred solitude. As I rebaited my hook and dropped my line back through the hole, watching the red and white bobber settle on the dark water below, I felt that deep contentment that only comes from being exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you love. I had no idea I was being watched. By 8 o'clock, something felt off. In over 40 years of ice fishing these Michigan waters, I developed an instinct for reading a lake's mood. Today, that instinct was screaming. The ice conditions were perfect. 16 solid inches, crystal clear beneath a light dusting of snow. My Eskimo shelter was positioned in my usual spot over the deep channel where walleye liked to cruise. I'd punched 3 holes with my auger, the familiar growl of the engine echoing across the frozen expanse as steam rose from the fresh cuts. Everything should have been routine. But where was everyone else? Higgins Lake drew ice fishermen like moths to flame during February weekends. By this time, I should have been looking at a dozen other shelters dotting the ice, hearing the distant hum of augers and the occasional shout of celebration when someone landed a good fish. Instead, the lake stretched empty in every direction, a vast white canvas broken only by the dark line of pine trees along the shore. I tried to shake off the unease as I rigged my lines with fresh minnows, their silver bodies flashing in the morning light, filtering through my shelter. The familiar weight of my tackle box, the smooth action of my rods. These things usually centered me, not today. It was when I stepped outside to check my tip-ups that I saw them. Tracks in the snow, maybe 20 yards from my shelter, leading from the tree line toward the lake's edge before disappearing onto the wind-swept ice. I've appraised properties all over northern Michigan for decades. I know every track that belongs in these woods. Deer with their split hooves and delicate impressions, black bear with those distinctive 5-toed pads and claw marks, even the occasional wolf print, rare but unmistakable. These were none of those. The prints were massive, easily 6 inches across and nearly 8 inches long. 4 distinct toe impressions, each ending in what looked like claw marks that had gouged deep furrows in the snow, but it was the spacing that made my chest tighten. The stride length suggested something walking upright, something tall enough that each step covered more ground than any 4-legged animal should manage. I knelt beside the clearest print, my Danner boots, crunching in the snow. The edges were slightly melted as if whatever made them had been warm enough to soften the snow on contact. When I looked closer, I could see where the claws had scraped against the frozen ground beneath. My practical mind raced through explanations. A deformed bear walking on its hind legs, some kind of hoax. But the tracks showed none of the dragging or unsteady gait you'd expect from a bear forced upright. These prints showed purpose, confidence, something that belonged on 2 legs. I followed the trail with my eyes as it curved along the shoreline before vanishing where the wind had scoured the ice clean. Whatever had made these tracks had been here recently, maybe within the last few hours, moving with deliberate intent along the lake's edge. Standing there, I felt the first cold finger of real unease trace down my spine. In all my years on these waters, I'd never seen anything like those prints. I should have packed up right then. I'd been fishing for maybe 2 hours when the first howl cut across the lake. I looked up from my line, listening. In over 40 years of Michigan winters, I'd heard every sound the wilderness could make. Wolves, coyotes, even the occasional mountain lion that wasn't supposed to exist this far south. This was different. Too deep, for one thing. The sound seemed to come from something with a chest cavity twice the size of any wolf I'd ever heard. But it was more than just the depth that made the hair on my neck stand up. There was something almost conversational about it, like it was calling to something, expecting an answer. I waited, breath visible in the cold air, but no response came. Just the wind through the pines and the distant hum of my fish finder. Speaking of which, I glanced down at the screen and frowned. The neat clusters of fish that had been hovering near the bottom were gone. Not scattered, not moved to deeper water. Gone like they'd fled the area entirely. In all my years of ice fishing, I'd never seen fish abandon an area that quickly, unless something had spooked them bad. Something big. I tried to focus on my line, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Probably just a large wolf, maybe hungry enough to venture closer to the lake than usual. The fish finder could be acting up. Electronics got weird and extreme cold sometimes. Everything had a logical explanation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started as just an itch between my shoulder blades, the kind of sensation you get when someone's staring at you across a room. I found myself glancing toward the tree line more often, scanning the dark spaces between the pines. The morning sun was climbing higher, but the shadows under those trees seemed deeper than they should be, like they were swallowing the light. Another howl echoed across the frozen lake, closer this time. Much closer. This one raised every primitive alarm my brain possessed. It wasn't just the volume or the depth, it was the intelligence behind it. Wolves howl to communicate, sure, but this sounded like language. Like it was saying something specific, with intent and meaning I couldn't understand, but somehow recognized as deliberate. My hand moved instinctively to the 12 gauge, leaning against my tackle box. Dad's old double barrel loaded with buckshot. I'd brought it more out of habit than any real expectation of needing it. Now I was grateful for that habit. The fish finder remained stubbornly empty. Whatever was out there had cleared every living thing from this section of the lake. In the distance, I could see a few other ice fishermen working their holes, but they seemed impossibly far away across the white expanse. I should pack up. Every rational part of my mind was telling me to load my gear and head for the truck. But I'd driven 90 minutes to get here, and the ice conditions were perfect. Besides, I was probably just letting my imagination run wild. 61 years old and jumping at shadows like a kid. Still, I kept the shotgun within easy reach and found myself checking the tree line every few seconds, waiting for whatever was watching me to show itself. Despite the unsettling morning, by afternoon I'd managed to catch 6 decent perch and 2 good-sized walleye. The familiar rhythm of ice fishing had worked its usual magic. The methodical checking of lines, the satisfying weight of fish in my hands, the practiced motions of rebaiting hooks. For a few hours, I'd almost convinced myself that the strange tracks and eerie howls were just my imagination running wild in the isolation. I lifted my bucket to check the day's catch, feeling the solid weight of the fish sliding against each other in the icy water. Not bad for a day that had started so strangely. The walleye alone would make Sarah happy. She'd been asking me to bring home something substantial for weeks. I threaded a fresh minnow onto my hook, the familiar motion as automatic as breathing after 30-plus years on the ice. The sun hung low on the horizon now, painting the snow-covered pines around the lake's edge in shades of orange and purple. February days were short this far north, and I could feel the temperature dropping as the light faded. My breath came in thicker clouds. This was actually my favorite time to fish. The transition period when day fish gave way to night feeders. The walleye would start moving in the next hour or so, and I'd often had my best luck right around sunset. I adjusted my portable heater and checked my lines one more time, settling into the familiar routine. The ice shelter felt cozy with the heater running, my gear organized exactly how I liked it. My tackle box sat open beside me, flies and lures sorted in their proper compartments. The fish finder showed a few promising marks about 15 feet down. Everything was exactly as it should be, peaceful, productive, normal. I glanced at my watch. 5:32 p.m. I'd give it another hour or two if the fish were biting. The drive back to Traverse City would take about 90 minutes, putting me home by 9 or so. Perfect timing for a late dinner with Sarah. She'd want to hear about the day, and I'd have good stories to tell about the ones that got away. The familiar weight of Dad's old double barrel leaned against the shelter wall, more habit than necessity. In all my years of ice fishing, I'd never needed it for anything more than the occasional curious raccoon or fox. Tonight, though, I found myself glancing at it more often than usual. Darkness was coming fast now, the way it always did in February. The temperature on my thermometer read 18 degrees and dropping. I fired up my Coleman lantern, the white light pushing back the gathering shadows and casting a warm circle around my fishing spot. Time to see what the evening would bring. The afternoon had been productive. 6 decent perch and a couple of walleye in my bucket, their silver scales catching the fading light. I should have been satisfied. Hell, I should have packed up and headed home with a successful day under my belt. But there's something about evening fishing that always called to me. That magic hour when the big ones start moving in the deeper water. I was threading a fresh minnow onto my hook when movement caught my peripheral vision. At first I thought it was just the wind moving boughs along the eastern shore. The trees there grew thick and dark, their snow-laden branches creating deep shadows even in daylight. But this movement was different, purposeful, deliberate. Something large was making its way through those pines, and it wasn't following any game trail I knew. I stopped baiting my hook and focused on the tree line, maybe 150 yards away. The shape moved again, darker than the shadows around it, weaving between the massive trunks with an odd, rolling gait. My first thought was bear. It had to be a black bear, maybe coming down to the lake for water. But even as that rational explanation formed in my mind, something felt wrong about it. The thing was too tall. Even hunched over, as bears often moved through dense timber, this shape stood higher than any black bear I'd ever seen. And there was something in the way it carried itself that made my stomach tighten. Bears lumber, they crash through underbrush with the casual confidence of creatures that have nothing to fear. This thing moved with deliberate stealth, placing each step carefully, almost thoughtfully. I set down my rod and reached for the small binoculars I kept in my vest pocket. Through the lenses I could make out more detail, though the fading light and thick timber made it difficult. The shape was definitely moving on 2 legs, not 4. My mind immediately jumped to another explanation, maybe a hiker moving along the shore. But no human being was that large, that broad across the shoulders. The figure paused behind a massive white pine, and for a moment I lost sight of it entirely. I adjusted the focus on the binoculars, scanning left and right along the tree line. Nothing. Then, just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing, it stepped into a small clearing between two trees. What I saw through those binoculars made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It stood upright like a man, but no man ever born stood 8 feet tall with shoulders that broad. Dark, shaggy fur covered its entire frame, and its legs. Christ, its legs were wrong. They bent backward at what should have been the ankle, like a dog's hind legs, but supporting a massive, humanoid torso. But it was the head that made my hands start shaking so badly I could barely hold the binoculars steady. Elongated, lupine, with a muzzle that protruded far too much to be human. Yet it sat atop that thick neck in a way that was unnaturally upright, and it was looking directly at me. I was just reaching for my tackle box when I saw them. 2 amber yellow points of light, hovering about 7 feet off the ground, maybe 100 yards out near the eastern shore. At first I thought they might be reflectors on someone's equipment, maybe another fisherman setting up late, but as I held my Coleman lantern higher, the light caught them full on, and I realized with a sick drop in my stomach that I was looking at eyes. Eyes that were looking right back at me. I've spent 30 years appraising properties in remote corners of Michigan. I've surprised deer, black bears, even a few coyotes during my work. I know how animal eyes catch light, that flat, glassy reflection you get from a raccoon or possum. These weren't like that at all. These eyes had depth to them, an unmistakable awareness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The thing, whatever it was, stood perfectly still among the snow-laden pines. In the weak spill of my lantern light, I could make out a dark, hulking shape, but the details kept shifting in the shadows. What I could see didn't make sense. The silhouette was wrong for a bear, too tall, too upright. The shoulders were massive, broader than any man I'd ever seen. But they tapered down in a way that suggested a lean, powerful build underneath all that bulk. But it was the eyes that held me frozen. They never blinked, never wavered. There was an intelligence behind them that made my mouth go dry. This wasn't some startled animal caught in unexpected light. This was something studying me, taking my measure with the same careful attention I might give to evaluating a piece of property. I forced myself to move slowly, reaching down for the 12 gauge I'd propped against my ice shelter. My father's old double barrel felt reassuringly solid in my hands, but somehow I knew that whatever was watching me from the tree line wasn't impressed by my shotgun. Those amber eyes tracked my movement with what I can only describe as amusement. The worst part was the height. Even allowing for the slope of the shoreline, those eyes were at least 7 feet off the ground, maybe 8. No bear stands that tall. No man either. And the way they held position, not swaying like something balanced on hind legs, but steady as if standing upright, was the most natural thing in the world. I don't know how long we stared at each other across that frozen lake. Could have been seconds. Could have been minutes. The only sounds were the soft hiss of my Coleman lantern and the distant whisper of wind through the pines. Then, without warning, the eyes blinked. A slow, deliberate closing and opening that somehow conveyed more menace than any growl or snarl. When they opened again, I understood with crystalline clarity that I was no longer the observer here. I was prey. And whatever was watching me from those dark pines was deciding whether or not it was hungry. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my fishing line, pretending to rebait the hook, while my eyes darted toward the tree line. The creature had vanished after that deliberate blink, melting back into the shadows between the pines, like it had never been there at all. But I knew it was still watching. I could feel those amber eyes on me, studying my every movement. I forced myself to go through the motions, checking my tip-ups, adjusting my portable shelter, even casting my line back into the hole I'd drilled through the ice. All the while, my peripheral vision swept the darkness beyond my lantern's glow. My heart hammered so loud in my chest, I was certain the sound would carry across the frozen lake. Then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, too tall and wrong-shaped to be anything natural. It was circling me. Not the random wandering of a curious animal, but a deliberate, calculated movement. I was smart enough to recognize predatory behavior when I saw it. I'd spent years appraising properties in rural Michigan, walking through woods where bears and wolves roamed. I knew how real predators moved. This was different. This had purpose, intelligence. I reached for my father's old 12-gauge, trying to keep the movement casual. The familiar weight of the double barrel should have been comforting, but my hands trembled as I checked that both chambers were loaded. Buckshot. Good for close range, if it came to that. The shadow moved again, this time on the opposite side of my position. It had covered maybe 60 yards in complete silence, on ice. I'd been ice fishing for decades, and I knew how sound carried across a frozen lake. A man walking out here would make noise. The crunch of snow, the scrape of boots on ice. This thing moved like smoke. I pretended to check my fish bucket, stealing glances as I bent down. There, another glimpse of movement, this time closer to the shoreline. It was definitely circling, keeping to the edge of the darkness, just beyond where my lantern light could penetrate. Every few minutes, it would shift position, always maintaining the same distance, always keeping me in sight. The methodical nature of it chilled me more than the February air. This wasn't some confused animal drawn by curiosity or the scent of fish. This was hunting behavior, patient, deliberate, smart. I tried to count the positions where I'd spotted movement, mapping its route in my mind. North tree line, east shore, south of my shelter. It was working its way around me in a wide circle, taking its time learning my position and my gear. Those amber eyes were cataloging everything. My shelter, my equipment, the distance to my truck parked up on the access road. My breath came in short puffs that crystallized in the frigid air. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to abandon my gear and sprint for the truck. But something deeper, some primitive understanding, told me that running would trigger something I wasn't prepared to face. So I sat there in the glow of my lantern, hands wrapped around my shotgun, and waited for whatever was circling me in the darkness to make its next move. The thing stepped forward into my lantern's circle of light. My mind simply refused to process what I was seeing. Every rational thought I'd ever had about the world shattered in that moment. The creature stood maybe 30 yards away, and in the yellow glow of my Coleman lantern, I could see every impossible detail. It had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall, but it wasn't standing fully upright. Instead, it hunched forward with massive shoulders that looked like they could snap a man in half. The posture was all wrong. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something that violated every natural law I thought I understood. Its legs were digitigrade, forcing it to walk on what looked like elongated toes. Shaggy dark fur covered its entire body, matted and wild, catching the lantern light in patches. But it was the head that made my stomach drop. A wolf's skull, elongated muzzle filled with teeth that were too long, too sharp, protruding even with its mouth closed, except that head sat on a neck that held it too upright, too human in its positioning. Steam rose from its nostrils in the frigid air, each breath visible in the cold. Those amber eyes never blinked, never looked away. They held an intelligence that made my skin crawl, a calculating awareness that was studying me just as intently as I was staring at it. This wasn't some rabid animal or confused bear. This was something far worse. My hands had gone completely numb, and I realized I was gripping my fishing rod so tightly that my knuckles ached. My Duluth trading pants that had kept me warm all day might as well have been tissue paper. Cold fear was seeping through every layer I wore. My Danner boots felt rooted to the ice. The creature's claws caught the light as it shifted its weight, 3 inches long, curved like scythes, designed for ripping and tearing. They clicked against the frozen surface of the lake with each small movement, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the winter silence. Everything about it was wrong. The proportions, the posture, the way it held that massive wolf head with such deliberate control. The 12-gauge leaning against my ice shelter suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. I found myself counting each exhalation, watching the rhythm of its breathing. 1, 2, 3. As if keeping track of its breathing could somehow make this make sense, could force this impossible thing back into the realm of logic and reason where I'd lived my entire adult life. But there was no explaining away what stood before me in that circle of lantern light. No rational property appraiser's mind could categorize or dismiss what I was seeing. The Dogman was real, and it was looking right at me. What happened next still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The creature, I have to call it that because no other word fits, tilted its massive wolf-like head to one side, studying me with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. This wasn't the mindless curiosity of a bear investigating a campsite. This thing was thinking. Those amber eyes swept methodically across my setup, the ice shelter, my fishing gear spread across the frozen surface, the bucket of fish I'd caught. It was taking inventory, processing what it saw with the same deliberate attention I'd use when appraising a property. The head tilted the other direction, and I caught the full profile of that elongated muzzle, the way its ears swiveled forward to catch every sound I made. Then it took a step closer. The sound of those claws scraping against the ice cut through the winter air like fingernails on a chalkboard. Click scrape, click scrape. Each deliberate step sent vibrations through the frozen lake that I could feel in my boots. The creature's massive shoulders rolled with each movement, that shaggy dark fur rippling in waves across muscles that could probably snap me in half without effort. Another step. Closer now, maybe 25 yards. A low rumbling started deep in its throat. Not quite a growl, but something far more unsettling. It sounded almost conversational, like it was talking to itself, working through some internal decision about what to do with me. The sound made every primitive instinct I had scream at me to run, but my legs felt like they'd been filled with concrete. Those backward bent legs carried it with surprising grace across the uneven ice. It moved with the confidence of something that belonged here, that had crossed this frozen lake before. How many times? How long had it been watching other fishermen, other people who'd never made it home? Those amber eyes never left me, never blinked. The intelligence behind them was calculating, patient. It was in no hurry because it knew something I was just beginning to understand. Out here on this frozen lake, in the middle of nowhere, I was completely at its mercy. The creature paused again, head cocking as it examined my vest, the way I clutched my father's shotgun. Steam rose from its breath in the frigid air, and I could see every detail of that elongated muzzle, the way its lips pulled back slightly to reveal those fangs. Not in aggression, in what almost looked like curiosity. It took another step, and the ice creaked under its weight. That's when the full horror of my situation hit me. This thing wasn't just some unknown animal that had wandered onto the lake. It was a predator that had deliberately sought me out, studied my patterns, waited for the right moment. And now, with the methodical patience of something that had done this before, it was deciding what came next. The rumbling in its throat grew deeper, more thoughtful, and I realized with crystal clarity that I was about to find out just how intelligent this creature really was. 20 feet became 15, 15 became 10. I could hear its breathing now, deep, measured inhalations that sent visible clouds of steam into the frigid air. The sound wasn't the rapid panting of an animal, but something deliberate, controlled, human-like in its rhythm, yet impossibly deep. At 5 feet, the smell hit me like a physical force. Wild musk so thick I could taste it. Wet fur, pine needles, and something else underneath. Something ancient and predatory that made every instinct scream at me to run. But my legs wouldn't move. My finger rested on the shotgun's trigger, but the weapon felt useless against something that shouldn't exist. The creature stopped just beyond arm's reach and lowered its massive head toward my fish bucket. Those amber eyes never left mine, even as its elongated muzzle investigated the perch I'd caught. The wolf-like head tilted with an almost human curiosity, ears pricking forward as it examined my equipment. Steam rose from its nostrils as it sniffed, and I caught a glimpse of those fangs, ivory daggers designed for tearing flesh. This close, the wrongness of it overwhelmed me. The shaggy dark fur was matted with ice crystals and forest debris. Its shoulders were broader than any linebacker's, tapering to that unnaturally narrow waist. But it was the intelligence in those eyes that truly terrified me. This wasn't some mindless beast. It was studying me, my gear, my situation with the calculating awareness of a predator that had learned to think. The creature straightened slightly, and I realized just how massive it truly was. Even hunched forward, its head was nearly 2 feet above mine. Those digitigrade legs shifted its weight with surprising grace, claws clicking against the ice with each subtle movement. The sound sent shivers down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It reached toward my tackle box with one massive hand, no paw, the motion slow and deliberate. 3-inch claws extended from fingers that were too long, too articulated to be purely animal. I watched, paralyzed, as it manipulated the latch with an almost delicate precision that defied everything I understood about wildlife. The lid popped open. The creature peered inside, that wolf-like head tilting again as it examined my lures and sinkers. I could hear a low rumbling from deep in its chest. Not quite a growl, more like the sound of distant machinery. a sound of consideration. Those amber eyes flicked back to mine, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, we simply stared at each other. I saw something there that made my blood freeze. Recognition. Not just awareness, but understanding. It knew exactly what I was doing here, and what I represented. A trespasser in its domain. The creature's nostrils flared as it took in my scent, and I realized, with growing horror, that it was memorizing me. Those intelligent eyes cataloged every detail of my face, my gear, my fear. When it was finished studying me, it would decide my fate. The rumbling in its chest grew deeper, more pronounced. Not aggressive, but thoughtful. Like it was weighing options I couldn't begin to imagine. That's when I knew I had to move. Now or never. The creature's amber eyes never left mine as I began my retreat. Moving with the deliberate slowness of a man defusing a bomb, I took one step back, then another. My Danner boots found purchase on the ice with each careful placement, their aggressive tread gripping despite my trembling legs. The beast tilted its wolf-like head, those intelligent eyes tracking my movement with what I can only describe as curiosity. It followed, not stalking, not charging, but matching my pace step for step. Its digitigrade legs moved with an eerie silence across the frozen surface, massive shoulders rolling beneath that shaggy dark coat. I caught glimpses of those exposed fangs with each breath it took. 20 yards to my truck. 15. 10. The creature stopped suddenly, lowering its head to examine my abandoned ice shelter. Those 3-inch claws scraped against the ice as it pawed at my equipment with an almost playful motion. It knocked over my tackle box, sending lures scattering, then picked up my thermos with surprising delicacy. The sight of that massive, clawed hand manipulating the small object with such precision made my skin crawl. 5 yards from the truck, my heel caught a ridge in the ice. I stumbled, barely catching myself, and the shotgun slipped in my sweating grip. The creature's head snapped up at the sound, those amber eyes locking onto mine again. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, we stared at each other across the darkness. Then it did something that nearly broke my sanity. It huffed. A sound almost like amusement, if such a thing were possible, from that elongated muzzle. My shaking hand found the truck's door handle. The metal was so cold it burned through my gloves, but I'd never felt anything so wonderful. I fumbled for my keys, my fingers refusing to cooperate, dropping them twice onto the ice before finally managing to unlock the door. The engine turned over on the second try, and my headlights blazed to life. The creature stood motionless in the beam, fully illuminated for the first time. 7.5 feet of impossible anatomy. That wolf's head perched unnaturally upright on broad shoulders. Digitigrade legs that belonged on no earthly predator. Shaggy fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the eyes that haunted me most. Ancient, knowing, patient. I threw the truck in reverse, tires spinning on the icy boat launch, before finding traction. Through my rear window, I watched the creature grow smaller, but it never moved from where it stood. Even as I reached the main road, my headlights swept back across the lake one final time. It was still there, a dark silhouette against the white ice, watching me leave. I drove the 60 miles home without stopping, my hands welded to the steering wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs. In my rear-view mirror, the darkness of Higgins Lake gradually disappeared, but those amber eyes remained burned into my retinas. I never went back for my gear, Left $1,000 worth of equipment on that ice, including my auger and my grandfather's tackle box. The insurance claim listed it all as stolen, which felt like the truth, even if I couldn't explain by what. That was 3 years ago. 3 years since I left my ice shelter, my auger, my tackle box, and 30 years of accumulated fishing gear scattered across the ice of Higgins Lake. I drove home that night, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The shotgun on the seat beside me checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see those amber eyes reflecting my taillights. I never went back for the equipment. My wife Sarah noticed the change immediately. "Where's your gear, Ethan?" she asked when I came home that night, seeing me walk through the door with nothing but the shotgun and the clothes on my back. I told her I'd had engine trouble. Had to leave everything and catch a ride back to town. She believed me then, but when weeks passed and I made no move to retrieve my equipment, when I stopped checking ice conditions obsessively every morning, when February turned to March and I never mentioned fishing again, she knew something had happened. "You've been ice fishing since before I met you," she said one evening, studying my face across the dinner table. 32 years of marriage, and every winter you disappear to those lakes, like you're answering some kind of call. Now you won't even look at the fishing reports. I couldn't tell her the truth. How do you explain to someone that everything you thought you knew about the world was wrong? That there are things out there that shouldn't exist? Things that watch us with intelligence older than our understanding? Sarah's a practical woman, a retired school principal who deals in facts and evidence. She would have insisted I see a doctor. Maybe suggested I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I was. Maybe I sold my remaining gear that spring. Rods, reels, electronics. Told Sarah I was getting too old for winter camping, that my joints couldn't handle the cold anymore. She didn't buy it, but she stopped asking questions. The hardest part wasn't giving up fishing. It was carrying the knowledge alone. I'd spent 61 years believing in a world that made sense, where every mystery had an explanation waiting to be discovered. I was a real estate appraiser, for Christ's sake. I measured properties, evaluated foundations, assessed value based on observable facts. My whole life was built on evidence and logic, but some things can't be measured or appraised. Some things exist in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're brave enough to admit might be true. Tonight, listening to the wind howl around our house in Traverse City, watching snow pile against the windows, I finally understand why I'm telling this story. It's not because I want people to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I'd believe me if someone else told me this tale. It's because that creature, whatever it was, changed something fundamental in how I see the world. I think about those amber eyes sometimes, the intelligence I saw there. It could have killed me easily, but it chose not to. Maybe it was curious about me, the same way I was terrified of it. Maybe we were both just trying to understand something that didn't fit our expectations. The Michigan woods are full of stories like mine, passed down through generations of hunters and fishermen who've seen things they can't explain. I used to dismiss those stories as folklore, campfire tales meant to entertain tourists. I don't dismiss them anymore.